Well, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Hope you had a good night last night, wherever you have been. Many of you were at the cultural house, eating fish and lamb and so on. But now we are on day number 2. And we start this day number 2 with a keynote session. And we are happy to present Dr. Erik Glöersen. He's a senior consultant from Norway, but he's working for a company called Spatial Foresight in Paris. He's also a researcher and a lecturer of economic geography at the University of Geneva. He previously worked for the Nordic Research Center on Territorial Development, Nordregio in Stockholm. 2 years ago, he led a foresight exercise in rural communities of Iceland, Greenland, and the Faroe Islands, funded by the Nordic Council of Ministers Arctic Cooperation Program. He has also been working on a lot of ESPON projects, especially the ESPON GeoSpecs project on development opportunities in areas with geographic specificities and of the strategy development process for the Alpine Space Program. Erik's presentation today is about using foresight to trigger entrepreneurship and growth in West Nordic rural communities. Thank you.
Probably best you wear the smoke, it'll dominate our headset.
Put it on like this. Okay.
Check.
Okay. Everyone here? It's okay. Thank you.
Just use the arrow spot.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Greta, for the introduction. Okay, making a lot of noise. Good morning to all. Thank you very much for this invitation to speak here today. Thank you for the very pleasant dinner yesterday. There was a small maybe misunderstanding in the presentation, as I have 2 presentations today. And this presentation, the one you referred to, is the second one later today on the foresight and foresight workshops we had in local communities. What I'll start with today is a presentation on development opportunity and territorial diversity and factoring territorial diversity in development adaptation strategies. This presentation is inspired by an ESPON project, as you mentioned, the ESPON GeoSpecs project on development opportunities in areas with geographic specificities. Trying then to reflect on how the results from this project could help putting northern research into perspective. We all seen yesterday how economic globalization, climate change, all these challenges create a need for transnational investigations, for dialogues, for policies. And a bit of the question is, what are really the tools, what are the words we need to connect across countries? What elements can we use to then create the basis for this dialogue? How do we best do that? What are the best suited instruments and tools and words? We heard about these new connections we created. Very, very exciting new connections. The Seychelles and the Arctic coming together. Singapore being very interested in the Arctic. These new types of interlinkages. In this framework, in terms of territorial development, the Northern Territories have a number of distinguishing features. They have small and scattered settlements. They have limited infrastructure endowment. They have long distances to major markets. They may have they do have constraining climatic conditions. But can we say still, is there any reason for saying we are unique? The Northern Territories would be unique. Of course, uniqueness has been very much promoted for the Northern area, not least in the European context. When Norway, Sweden, Finland negotiated their entry in the European Union, they were very much highlighting, oh, we are special, we need special treatment for our northern territories. They are so very special, they even managed to get Objective 1, so this first, most important European support status for these areas. But you can see a number of risks with this promotion of uniqueness. In terms of development challenges and needs, maybe it leads to create conflicts between other areas, to create us as being unique against the rest, when we can see, when we go into the discussions, that there are a lot of common points, instead of saying the northern unique areas against the southern struggling with other types of issues, the eastern lagging, etc., all of these putting against each other instead of seeing the connections. In terms of development opportunities, emphasizing this northern uniqueness, specialty, is maybe not the best way of understanding the interactions between the economic processes, the types of new trends, and how that benefit communities. Maybe it's a bit naive to think that because we would have new transport routes, because we would have new natural resource exploitation opportunities, this would necessarily benefit northern communities because they happen to be in that area. Maybe we need other types of tools and the ways of understanding territories to see this interconnection between economic development opportunities and territorial development. That northernness is maybe not the best framing instrument for this. So what I would like to go through today is some established European notions of territorial diversity and see how they could help framing the discussions about northernness and territorial development, and maybe establish links to other types of territories outside the northern territories. So what are these categories, these established categories? I'll focus on three then established ones, which would be then mountain areas, islands, and sparsely populated areas. Shown here on this map, so you see that in the sparsely populated areas in blue. You have mountains shown in yellow here, you have islands coming up in pink, but then you already see that there are other colors coming up, which would then be areas where these different specificities overlap. So you have areas that can have multiple specificities at the same time. Iceland, you see, is quite specific in the European context in that respect, and combining most of the territory, combining all three types of specificities, which already then triggers some kind of reflection. Can we look at the connection? Is there anything specific? As they are interlinked, overlapping in this way, it may be difficult to see what is the specific effect of being sparsely populated as compared to being an island, as compared to being mountainous. All of these complicated overlaps create difficulties in seeing what makes these areas specific as one compared to the other. And the other thing is, of course, these types of delineations then of different specificities is only one aspect among many others of the uniqueness of each individual territory. If I just take the example, zooming in now, mountain areas in Europe. Here you see then the mountains from the Alps, the Carpathians, some of the German Black Forest mountains, etc. And overlapping on that, we've put the areas within commuting distance to the major cities, so in different shades of blue and purple here. What areas within the mountains are within commuting distance? And so analyzing these types of what being a mountain implies, you see a number of specificities, that there are climatic change elements, processes going on that are different from the lowland, that you have fragilities, that you have tourism attractiveness, that you have transport issues. But of course, if you try to look at the output, what happens in terms of economic trends, in terms of activity patterns, the main difference will not be between mountain and lowland. It will be mainly because between those that are within commuting distance to big cities and towns and those that are outside. So you have a specificity in processes, but it does not lead to something that you can observe and saying, well, of course we have to have policies for mountains because they are lagging or because they have a lot more agriculture than different types of economic profile. It doesn't have an effect like that, but there is specificity in the process and not in the output. This we can also illustrate just another example now from sparsely populated sparsely populated areas in Spain, which you then see here indicated with these black hashes, the most sparsely populated parts of Spain, and behind that we've put the concentrations of manufacturing jobs. Also interesting just to see what does sparsity, what does it lead to? Does it have any economic impact? Well, you find sparsely populated areas with absolutely zero manufacturing, and you have sparsely populated areas coming up in red on this map, which are actually concentrations of manufacturing jobs. So extremely different types of outputs, but still behind sparsity, similarities in terms of challenges of lack of a critical mass, difficulties of creating cost-efficient service provision, of having balanced labor markets. So parallels once again in the processes, but not in the outputs. So maybe it can be seen as a paradox then. How did these territorial diversity categories make it into the European Treaty, become something, one of these central elements of the European territorial policy in this Article 174 of the treaty, which says then that particular attention should be paid to regions which suffer from severe and permanent natural demographic handicaps, such as northernmost regions with very low population density, island, cross-border, and mountain regions. Well, compared to what I just said, you see that there is a very different perspective in the treaty. First of all, they consider all of this as handicapped. So this section is actually even introduced by the notion, among the regions concerned by backwardness, particular attention should be paid. So they don't see this diversity of outputs, they see this, okay, we have a problem of backwardness, and within this framework we should maybe look at these types of territorial diversity. Another thing that you can notice is that this list seems a bit haphazard. Why have you put in cross-border suddenly in here? Why only northernmost regions with very low population density? It appears more as a political thing. Okay, you have had pressure groups on different types and they have somehow made it into the treaty. Cross-border is not really a permanent feature. You have had borders have been changing in Europe. Does it make being across the border, does that really make a challenge in any way? Or is it on the contrary, being on the border that you cannot cross, that would be the challenge? So, politically speaking, an approach that can appear as quite misinformed in a number of respects. First, as I mentioned, because geographic specificity can be as much as an opportunity as a handicap. We've mentioned this yesterday. Being sparsely populated can imply that there are vast uninhabited areas, potentially underused areas that can be attractive in many respects. Being an island on a mountain is quite obviously an attractive factor for tourism. So approaching these areas in terms of handicaps implies that the focus is on what these areas cannot achieve rather than the possibilities. And even in areas where you see that there is an obstacle, that mountainousness is preventing interactions, that being an island creates an additional cost. This does not necessarily lead to backwardness. You can have an issue of insularity, of mountainousness, of sparsity, but you have overcome it through appropriate policies. So, or through another types of factor, because you have an exceptional resource, because you have been very good at attracting tourists. But then saying, because you've been successful, we no longer deal with your geographic specificity, seems like a contradiction. Especially in terms of policy making, because these specificities are permanent features and they create constant effects. So if you have a policy that succeeds in countering this structural imbalance, and then you say, oh, now you've no longer lagging, we stop the policy. So because our policy has been successful, we are going to stop it. This is somehow what the treaty suggests. So there are certainly some issues in the European Treaty about the way in which these types of territorial diversity are dealt with. What would be required is not a focus on backwardness, but on how to incorporate these types of notions in sectoral and spatial planning policies. And in this respect, it's important to see that all these types of territorial diversity are different ways in different ways, limit the interaction. So either because you have a body of water as an island around, you have a very long distance to your neighbors in the sparsely populated areas, you have constraining topography, all of this creates small and isolated communities, which in the context of economic deregulation creates types of vulnerability, so lack of critical mass, lack of diversity in the economic activities. So in a way, they all converge into similar types of vulnerability. However, the other important aspect is the lack of a systemic approach, the fact that we are talking about diversity, but we do not think diverse contributions to overall economic, social, and environmental harmony or balance. If we go back to the European Commission's Green Paper on Territorial Cohesion, which was now 6 years ago, they have a very poetic introduction about describing Euros from the frozen tundra of the Arctic Circle to the tropical forest of Guyane, from the Alps to the Greek islands, etc. And saying then that territorial cohesion would be a means of transforming diversity an asset that contributes to sustainable development, prosperity, and competitiveness. So basically introducing this diversity as helping public policy to improve its perspective of sustainable development, ensuring that all territorial assets are used, and guiding policies to connect different territories so that their complementarities are exploited. But it's quite obvious that we've had these debates launched now 6 years ago, and we haven't come much further. We have not come any closer to a concrete implementation of the SDG because we have the idea of smart specialization, diversity of approaches, but the objective is always the same. Every territory has to maximize its added value, its gross product, if one likes. The idea that you can have different territories with different types of ambitions that feed into an overall system in different ways, some providing ecosystem services, living environments, other types of outputs than just economic added value as such, is very difficult to bring into the debate. So the idea of combining a diversity of development paths also with the diversity of development ambitions appears very difficult in the European debate. So still, if we're going then to try to imagine how could we improve this type of debate, this discussion, how can we create a scientific evidence base to bring this debate forward? To try to imagine how these categories could actually help in these territories and make them useful tools to move forward. Some key elements then need to be highlighted. First of all, that it's then very important not to try to search for any statistical correlation, that the evidence base to work with these is not that they are specific in terms of socioeconomic patterns, in terms of performance, but it is in terms of the processes. So the objective would be then to identify causal relation linked to this specificity rather than looking at specificities in the patterns. And even these causal processes does not necessarily have to be judged on the basis of the extent to which they produce actual effects, but on how they could inform policy options. So the most important aspect is not does your sparsity make you poor? Does it make you this or that in terms of economic activities or other types of performance? The question is, what would happen if? What happens if you constrain mobility through high taxes on fossil fuel? What happens if you develop tourism? What happens if you reduce the access to public services in areas? What types of specific effects would this or that political option have depending on you being a mountain, you being sparsely populated, you being an island? That is the key question. So it doesn't depend on whether this process actually occurs, it's more a hypothetical process. What would happen if? So in our this GeoSpecs project, we tried to think what types of analytical model, what types of just synthetic representation could we create to make an evidence base, which is not a figure saying these usual, these need help because they have this or this percentage of unemployment, but saying we need to focus, these areas could help you make better policies because they function differently from other types of territories. And we created this very simple model, simply saying we have different columns here, and you have the middle with defining features for each type of territory. Intermediate processes linked to these, and then some at the left, challenges emerging from that, and opportunities at the right. And if I now take the example of sparsely populated areas, which is maybe the more generally relevant for the northern territories, what can we observe? Well, in sparsely populated areas, most settlements will be based on the presence of a natural resource of some kind. That is usually how the settlements have emerged in these sparsely populated areas. What does this imply in terms of their opportunities? Well, there is a strong dependency on primary economic activities and on the public sector in general, which of course creates opportunities for continued development of mining, forestry, ecological agriculture. And also a number of assets for energy production and nature-oriented tourism. But in terms of challenges, we have a number of potential and often very real conflicts between nature conservation, energy production, mining, herding, tourism development. We have a number of other defining features that are typical for the sparsely populated areas. They are almost all, they have different types of harsh climates. Many of them are mountainous. They are all in different types of remote locations, and they have small and scattered settlement patterns. This together explains, I'm not going into all the details maybe here, but they together explain why there are higher transportation costs, higher cost of service provision, so lower costly access to services. They also, the small and scattered settlement also explained then why we have small labor markets, we have a lack of critical mass, a lack of diversity, and a trend for out-migration. But at the same time, they also explain why we have strong local identities, we have a very high potential for the use of ICT to foster e-services, to improve the service provision, and we have a very qualities in terms of, or assets in terms of quality of life and trust between local actors. So we end up with this, what we call the nexus model, a system which can then present as general for these type of territories, which gives ideas of the types of levers that policies could play on to specifically facilitate development or reach specific ambitions within these areas. If we think now in terms of climate change and mitigation, if that is then the political objective we would like to apply to this type of model, we can extract a number of relevant factors. The coexistence of these conflicts between exploitation and conservation at the same time as we have cohesive local communities and strong identities. So local communities which you can really try to engage with, have a dialogue with, because they are so cohesive, they have these strong identities, but at the same time strong conflicts that need to be dealt with. We have issues of limited access to services of general interest, which are important when you think of climate change mitigation measures, which may potentially further limit this in some respect. We have a lot of resources in the areas that often are left unexploited in a context where input and resource intensive exploitation is privileged. And we have a number of ICT related opportunities that are very insufficiently exploited. So from such a model, within a certain type of normative political agenda, we can extract a number of relevant levers for policy making. So what can we generally conclude from it? While quantitative evidence can inform the policy making in relation to these types of types of territories, what the evidence base we need to produce will necessarily be a qualitative understanding of causal processes. So that's a big challenge in terms of communication of evidence base, which is not firm statistical figures, which is really a synthesis of causal processes, which are not judged on the basis of their effects, but on their potential, their relevance in relation to a policy-making agenda. We see that these categories can contribute to design better policies, and maybe most importantly that they help seeing beyond traditional divisions. They help seeing beyond advanced and lagging. They help seeing north and south. They help establishing these bridges because we look beyond the result and we try to see the parallels in the processes. So seeing how we can be similar in spite of having maybe very different levels of wealth, of types of lifestyles, etc. And we also see that when you produce, I've now shown you the example of the nexus model for sparsely populated areas, but you can make parallels between these categories. And we can also then go between the levels, because the type of model you saw then for the general for sparsity could then be reapplied in a specific community in a sparse environment, sparsely populated environment, and see then how do you as an individual community relate to sparsity in general? What is your specific asset? So comparisons between levels. So for the Northern Territories, I think one can gain a better understanding of why we would think this specificity of Northern Territories by approaching them as cases of these general categories, so linking them into a European policy agenda and a wider, even global policy agenda, because these are the tools that would help us projecting into other environments. Going beyond then differences and rather looking at similarities. And I try to show how then, in relation to specific policy objectives, such as climate change mitigation and adaptation, one can gain in efficiency, one can gain in focus by identifying these levers linked to types of territorial diversity. Those are my conclusions. I would be happy, I hope we can have a dialogue around that, and I would be happy to hear your reactions. Thank you.
Thank you, Erik, for a very interesting contribution. I'm sorry to have picked the wrong paper to present you, but I can assure you that's the same person. This is Erik Glöersen. It was just the topic that was wrong. But now we are open for questions. We have up to 15 minutes if you want to. So, do I see question coming?
You had all the answers, apparently.
Probably.
Okay, over there.
There we have it.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Very interesting indeed. I come across similar questions also in the Alps, so good to start also with get out of into other spatial dimensions as necessary, the ones we are confronting here those 2 days. I just wondered if you can say a little bit more why you started, I know your geograph, but with sparsely populated, or I mean population as a first category to to say what is the specificity of a territory. Why first that one?
Okay. Well, the idea was, I think one of the elements is that I think when you look at the effects of insularity and mountainousness, in some ways they are all types of sparsity in different ways. Well, people can be very densely populated, they can be very tightly together on an island or in mountain areas, but they are always in different ways isolated from their surroundings. So maybe sparsity is a way, somehow the synthesis of these different categories, but not sparsity in the way we think of the population density per unit. It's in terms of access to neighbors, to other type opportunities, to labor, to employment, jobs, to people to interact with. The other element where I think this is the most general category for the northern territories. Of course, you have mountainous areas, you have islands, but this is the most generally relevant one. So this was the idea. It is a bit complex here too. We are going between policy field. We have a northern research here, we have the European policy, and trying to bridge these elements is quite complex. So if I found it difficult today to try to present all of the mountain policy agenda and the sparsity policy issues and the insularity and trying to bring them together. So I chose this example.
Question as well?
Yeah.
Well, a comment. You talk about the use of quantitative data and the qualitative effects of how you use it. I find it very interesting that you can't use data and predict the outcome regardless of the circumstances in which it's being applied. I find that very interesting. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that? How you would you mean that you should factor in the effects of how you use the data on the population that you're applying it to? Isn't that that's how I understood it?
Well, this is maybe also in reaction. There have been, when the European Commission started, so basically what happened, the policymakers created this treaty, the article of the treaty. Then the European Commission got it in their hands and said, what do we do with it? And their first reaction was, we compile unemployment, economic data of different kinds, and we'll look at it. And then they said, it's mountain areas are just as diverse as the rest of Europe. Okay, maybe next issue. And that's where I think they are wrong, and that's where I think we have to think differently, especially if we have a policy that is not, whose focus is not convergence, but it's allowing everyone to use their opportunities, and then taking in this group and saying, are you different, are you not different, is the wrong approach. You have to see what is happening, what are the types of processes. And it's a bit the same when you have this discussion of Northern and the rest of Europe. The discussion was in the beginning, you shouldn't have any policies because you are doing better than most of Europe. Is there any relevance to doing that? Is there any relevance? You are implicitly comparing then Northern Sweden, Finland, and within this policy with London, Paris, Frankfurt. Does it make any sense? So this trying to challenge this idea of that this would be the evidence base for the policy making, I think is very important. And as I showed, it is a great challenge because the political situation is so. We have a very bad institutional basis for doing this. We have a very strong idea that the evidence base should be these facts. And both of these things need to be addressed to get beyond that. But I think it would be very important to make the basis, to create the basis for a dialogue which is different. So I think it would be very beneficial also for the Northern Territories to address this challenge.
I understand that your contribution was mainly based on the Geospecs project, which is an ESPON project, which Erik has been a part of. But he has been involved in more projects, and I have to mention Territorial Diversity is one project which I was involved in too. You might have used some knowledge from that, and I saw that you mentioned the services of general interest as well, which is also an ESPON project. So did I forget anything about projects which might be relevant, you have been involved in?
No, I think those were the main elements, but yes, this started as more case studies based and then was expanded to all of Europe through this Geospecs project, yes.
Yeah. Well, worked. Yeah, let's see.
Thank you for your excellent presentation. Maybe it's too early in the morning for me, or maybe simply I don't understand territorial planning so well, but I was wondering, I mean, those your three specificities, islands, mountain areas, sparsely populated areas. So I got that impression that they are problems. I mean, when you try to attract people to go move there and live there, or when you try to build some kind of settlements there or have planning. But I mean, my question is that what kind of factor, advanced technology is there? Advanced technology like ICT? Because I mean, all these three specificities are dealing with access. What kind of access there is? And now, I mean, comparing 100 years ago, 200 years ago, I mean, we have so much better technology now. We can reach whatever part of the globe. So how come those things can be so big problems in a way? Because I have seen this in Finland, that they are problems. We don't have mountains, but I mean, sparsely populated areas, that's the problem. So what about technology? Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure they're not necessarily problems. I mean, many of these areas are extremely dynamic. If you look at some Swiss mountain tourism hotspots, they have absolutely no problem. You're also parts of Finland. I mean, Levi, Kittilä, they are not problems, are they?
Well, so open in Finland, they are.
Well, some of them, of course they have challenges, they have issues, but they are not problems as such. Now, your comment on accessibility is very interesting, because as you say, the accessibility has improved so much. So maybe the issue is not that further improved accessibility would solve anything. Maybe the issue is you still have these gradients. When an entrepreneur chooses where to go, they have to choose between even higher accessibility, and we tend to reflect on accessibility in much too general terms instead of looking what does the forestry industry in this part of eastern Finland actually need. We think in terms of, well, we need a highway, this would create a new solution, they need to get more easily to the nearest town. Is that the issue? Or do we actually manage to think about the precise obstacles to an identified opportunity being exploited, being it fisheries in northern Iceland, being it forestry in Finland, being it tourism in the Faroe Islands? So this more, not a general accessibility, but much more specifically. Now, in terms of technology, what we've seen generally is the critical mass of these areas is still insufficient to develop the really adequate solutions for them. So a lot of things have been happening in Finland, we've seen it, but implementation is still very far ahead. So the great opportunities we see really there. But I think the bottom line is not accessibility, it's feeling in the loop. If you look at these communities, which one are dynamic? It's not necessarily those with the best accessibility, often those that are in the, let's say, the wide periphery of big urban areas are the most, the less dynamic. Those that are really far out, but some of them have a real strong sense of identity, who we are, what we want. We feel part of something. Those are the ones that function, and this has nothing to do with physical accessibility.
Yeah, do you have one?
Yeah, I also have a question.
Sorry. Okay, sorry. Okay, and then here.
Norwegian Institute for Urban and Regional Research, or a comment, may. A very nice presentation, and I think you focus really on this, the quest for evidence-based policies, which has been, for the past 10 years at least, and quite a lot of discussion about. What I did find interesting is that you said that quantitative data can inform policies, but at the same time you said that evidence are not facts. And when we focus on using the qualitative statistical methods and so on, we are producing a lot of facts. So I think the real issue is how to use these facts, how to translate them into, or as you said, how to make a qualitative understanding of them. And then you're talking about the processes. But I think somewhere there is a missing link, it seems to me, and how we can use all these huge amounts of facts and be producing and reproducing them all the time. Employment figures, demographic data, etc., etc. But how to translate them into policies? You said the word processes. Could you elaborate a little bit more on that?
That's a very tricky question. I think in many respects, this is qualitative research. We work a lot with people. We work with perceptions. The risk when you're doing that is always that you are carrying along types of causal processes that actually belong in the past. So I think a lot of what I saw, at least in our own research, a lot of things we're doing is checking, are you really that agricultural still? Are you still that dependent on the natural resource in your local economy? Do you still have the population? Has the population decline been as strong as you think it is? For me, that's maybe what we do mostly with facts. Is, well, taking them out of the box, maybe throwing in them a bit when into interviews. Okay, you are saying that, but what I see from the figures is not exactly what you're saying. So using them like that as parts of the dialogue, instead of saying, oh, I have the fact will give you the solution. So using them in much more of a dialogue approach. If I have the time, maybe just to mention this the importance of this interaction with policy making, we try to rethink about sparsity too, because sparsity is generally defined as population density per unit. And if you look at how the outputs this produces, it's entirely dependent on how you circumscribe regions. So it doesn't really make sense. The way you draw the boundary defines who should be sparse. So instead of that, we said, you will be sparse if your population, the population you can find within a commuting distance from where you are, falls below a critical threshold. But that is also a debate with the policymakers. What is the commuting distance? What type of mobility do you want to have? What type of mobility do you observe? Maybe one thing. And the other thing, what type of mobility would you like to see developed? What is sustainable in terms of mobility? So even defining, circumscribing what is a sparsely populated area is a dialogue with a stakeholder, and it doesn't exist. There is no evidence independently of the normative message of the policymaker. And I think that's also a very important message. You can only produce evidence once you are in a dialogue with the policymaker. And that is, I think, very much when you heard about, well, for example, the wise words of President Putin saying climate change adaptation should be based on the evidence base. I'm sorry, there is no evidence independently of your decision to do something, of what you want to do. Then that is when we can start producing evidence. So challenging this linear perception of evidence.
Yeah, here we have a question.
Yes, a little bit further on the question from him earlier. Isn't it that, or I understood you in that sense that regarding sparse and mountain communities, that you are not actually pointing out them as a problem, but pointing them out as communities that need different policies and approach for solving their particular issues. Isn't that right?
Basically, yes. No, the idea of, yes, of seeing how they function differently, why they would not react in the same way to, for example, a liberalization of a deregulation of service provision. Why would this general policy have a different effect there, and then how would you need to adapt the policy so that it has the effect you would like it to have, the effect that is stated in the policy? I think that's why we need to look at these causal processes and how they function differently in different areas. Exactly.
We have time for more. We have time for one or two questions. Is that, yeah?
It seems like you're kind of looking at places which have a meaning which is related to a history and and social interactions which have evolved in a given environment also. So isn't it in our globalized world difficult to assume always this uniqueness of places and this that they have boundaries really you can consider as given when you try to adapt policies? I mean, we talk a lot about deterritorialization, right? With globalization. Isn't that a bit a problem in this approach too?
I would consider territories not the uniqueness of the territories not as a given, but as a project. So you build a community. You say that a community is linked to a territory, to a place, and so the territory is not given as unique, but it is created as unique in a way. And what I would react mostly on is the idea of uniqueness being transposed to then saying northern areas are unique. That is a problem. Trying to use this as a policy creation. We have northernness which we use as a tool for scientific investigation, for policy making, and trying to advocate that uniqueness, I see a real problem with. Because I don't think there is any project of uniqueness for the Northern Territories in general. But we can at least, based on the policy project of uniqueness for an individual territory, work on that project. I don't know if that's... yeah. So the question of scale of uniqueness is very important, I think.
The last question here. Yeah.
Where was it?
Thank you. About the last point that you have in the conclusions part, so you're saying that this putting the territorial diversity into climate change strategies can be an efficient thing. But what do you think, like, since climate change is going to change things probably in a very profound way, so doesn't it also have a very big impact on the system of or the different classifications of territorial diversities that you presented? Like, okay, mountains are still going to be mountains, but otherwise, at least in some parts of Europe, for instance, the sparsely populated Finnish Lapland is expecting to change in very, very profound ways due to climate change. So instead of being very peripheral place, it's aiming to become, or actually not just aiming, but trusting that it will become more central.
Yes, absolutely. These are the... We're not saying that these categories will be there forever. We're just saying how they could be useful for policy making today. So I think they could help creating a resilience in the face of challenges by understanding their processes. But absolutely, this is a work, and this is the model I showed could certainly be amended to try to have projections of in relation to a vision, maybe then of northern Finland, of other areas. But can you do this in general? I'm not sure. I mean, this is one perspective. We are not here to foretell what will happen. We don't know, but we can relate to policy projects. So the Nexus model, as I showed you, this model with all the arrows, it's just a starting point. Then you have a normative agenda coming on top of that, a project. And you need to just see how that project can be linked to the area. But definitely, yes, mountain areas, islands will change dramatically in terms of climate change, in terms of energy. Just think the energy crisis. What would life be in these northern sparsely populated areas if we have less, if the air accessibility is reduced, as maybe some projections would say, with much less fossil fuel? Can we imagine these northern areas without plane, or with no regular use of planes? I think that's a very dramatic change as well, socially speaking. So, of course, these realities will probably change dramatically, yes.
Well, that is it. Thank you, Erik Glöersen. We are now going straight over to the parallel sessions. One is going to be here and two on the other side. I have one announcement. The housekeepers here have asked me to kindly ask you to, during the day, take the plastic coffee cups with you outside from the lecture rooms and throw it in the trays outside. Okay, thank you. Já, það verður náttúrulega ekki hefna sko. Já, það er